How is it that there's one being but yet three persons? Or as Dr. James White is fond of saying, one what and three whos? How is it that God can be composed this way? And why doesn't the Bible just come right out and tell us that this is the way God is made up, if that's in fact the case? How can God be one and yet three at the same time? This, of course, is a question for modern people who hear this discussion about Trinity and begin to scratch their heads and think, this doesn't make sense to me in my mind, or as we're going to see, they're going to say the math doesn't add up. What is more, I say in my commentary, if God is God, right, this is really the crucial question in this part of my paper, how then can Yeshua and the Holy Spirit also be God? This can be a little confusing in conversations if you just go around saying, hey, guess what? Jesus is God. Jesus is God. You might be trying to convey that Jesus is divine or Jesus is deity without actually saying that Jesus is God. Because you end up creating, again, what I call an equivocation or an ambiguous statement by not elaborating on what you mean by saying Jesus is God. It's fair to say that we as Christians need to really be careful with the way we talk. I'm not saying that it's wrong to say that Jesus is God. I'm going to show you here a little bit later how that there's a passage in the book of John in the prologue where if we look at the Greek, there might be a warrant for understanding that we need to make a careful distinction between saying Jesus is divine versus Jesus is God, and perhaps maybe both are true. I believe they are, by the way. But the way we talk is going to be misunderstood by many people. Doesn't this position about Yeshua and the Holy Spirit being God, doesn't this position present logical incoherency? To modern skeptics of the Trinitarian position, then yes. This presents what many philosophers and logisticians and what I call analytic philosophers and analytic theologians, they say that this presents logical incoherency because we are really logical creatures and we're created to appreciate logical flow, logical thought, logical processes. There's nothing wrong with that. God created our minds, and we are to serve God with our mind, right? Recall the Shema versions that are rendered into the New Testament. Love God with your heart, with all your soul, with all your being, right? With all your might, and with all your mind. So the mind was created by God, so it's not wrong to appreciate the logical thought process. After all, if you had no appreciation for logic, then you would probably not be able to have an appreciation for math itself. And you probably wouldn't be able even to function in the world properly if you had no appreciation and basic understanding of math principles. So logic is important. So let's keep reading. As many Trinitarian critics like to argue, quote, the math doesn't add up, right? How can 1 + 1 + 1 = 1? That's what most critics like to say. This Trinity math problem, which is also referred to as the logical problem of the Trinity by many philosophers, both Christian and non-Christian, leads to frequent accusations of worshiping three gods. So, philosophers, both Christian and non-Christian, have discussions and disagreements about worshiping three gods, about worshiping one God in three modes, and we're trying to make sure as Orthodox Christians, both in the East and in the West, that we avoid these particular heresies. And we might call these classical historical heresies. We'll look at these a little later on down below in my commentary, but for now, let me just keep working through this paragraph. To my own personal understanding of the Trinitarian landscape, many varied approaches to understanding and disambiguating the Bible's, how shall we say, proprietary language surrounding God's ontological nature can be articulated for today's modern believers. What am I trying to say here? There is a kind of a built-in ambiguity in the Bible, and it's created by the fact that the language of the Bible does not spell out certain truth claims in ways that we moderns are used to looking for them, right, in linear fashion or in outline fashion or even in bullet point fashion. In the words of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy under the Trinity entry, listen to this, what I'm about to say here, which I think was put together by a Unitarian by the name of Dr. Dale Tuggy. The entry reads, quote, no Trinitarian doctrine is explicitly taught in the Old Testament. Now, isn't that interesting? And yet factual. There aren't verses that say, hear, O Israel, I am the Lord and I'm made up of three persons. End full stop. God doesn't talk that way in the Bible. It would have been nice if he did, by the way. Hear, O Israel, I am God, I am Son, I am Holy Spirit, and yet I'm all God. And then we've got this equivocation on the word God, right, which in the Hebrew is Elohim, which in the Greek is Theos. What do we make of all that? All right, so the entry here says no Trinitarian doctrine is explicitly taught in the Old Testament, and I think that's kind of true. We can infer sophisticated Trinitarians grant holding that the doctrine was revealed by God only later in the New Testament times and or in the patristic area, which is circa 100 to 800. They usually also add, though, that with hindsight we can see that a number of texts, notice hindsight is the key word there, we can see that a number of texts either portray or foreshadow the co-working of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.